A woman's heart stopped. For several minutes, there was no heartbeat, no measurable signs of normal brain function, no observable consciousness. When the team restarted her heart, she described watching the resuscitation from the ceiling. She named the instruments. She named the positions of the doctors. She described a specific exchange between two nurses that she could not have heard from the table. Medical staff later reported that several details of her account appeared to match the resuscitation procedure. In 2001, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel published a prospective study of 344 cardiac arrest survivors in the Lancet, one of the most rigorous medical journals on earth. His conclusion was precise and deeply uncomfortable for neuroscience. The findings raised difficult questions about whether consciousness can be fully explained by current models of brain function. In the 8th century CE, teachings traditionally attributed to Padmasambhava became associated with a text known as the Bardo Todal, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It described in exact sequential stages what happens to consciousness at the moment of death and in the interval between death and whatever follows. Van Lommel's clinical findings in the Bardo Todal reveal a series of striking structural parallels, not identical, yet similar enough to invite careful comparison. And roughly 2,500 years before Van Lommel's study, an Upanishad described a young man who traveled to the house of Yama, the Lord of Death, and asked the question Van Lommel spent 13 years investigating. Yama answered. This video maps all three investigations. What they agree on changes the question physics has not yet known how to ask. 18%. That is the proportion of cardiac arrest survivors who reported a near-death experience in Van Lommel's study. Not one or two edge cases, 62 patients out of 344 studied consecutively, beginning at the moment of resuscitation. This was not a survey of self-selected accounts. Between 1,988 and 1,992, Van Lommel and his colleagues tracked cardiac arrest survivors across 10 Dutch hospitals in a prospective study. The experiences followed a consistent sequence. Awareness outside the body, movement toward a light, encounter with deceased relatives, a sense of review, of seeing one's own life, a boundary, a threshold, the return. What distinguished Van Lommel's data from all previous accounts was one specific finding. Several patients accurately described events that occurred during clinical death, during a period in which normal brain function would not be expected, following cardiac arrest. In neuroscience, this presents a precise problem. Memory formation is generally understood to require brain activity, yet some patients later reported memories that researchers argue are difficult to reconcile with conventional explanations. That remains an open question. Van Lommel published a follow-up book in 2007 titled Consciousness Beyond Life. His hypothesis was careful and specific. The brain may not produce consciousness. It may receive and transmit it, the way a radio receives a signal it did not generate. The design of the next study was precise. Researchers placed objects on high shelves in cardiac arrest rooms, visible only from above. If a patient reported leaving their body and described the object correctly, it would constitute a verified account that could not be explained by prior knowledge or hallucination. This was the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, launched in 2008 by British resuscitation researcher Sam Parnia across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Austria. In 2014, Parnia published the results in the journal Resuscitation. One patient reported a period of conscious awareness during cardiac arrest. He later described aspects of the resuscitation process that investigators attempted to verify. The case became one of the most discussed findings from the study. Questions remain regarding how such experiences should be interpreted. Parnia's published conclusion was precise. The findings suggest that consciousness during cardiac arrest remains insufficiently understood and deserves further investigation. Before the ancient map, the mainstream objection must be stated clearly. Neuroscience offers 4 serious explanations for near-death experiences. Cerebral anoxia. Oxygen deprivation produces vivid hallucinations. REM intrusion. Dream state elements enter waking awareness at the threshold of death. Temporal lobe stimulation produces feelings of presence, light, and life review. Endogenous DMT and endorphin release creates euphoric and visionary states at extreme physiological stress. These are legitimate scientific proposals. They explain why NDEs feel vivid. They explain the consistency of the experience across cultures. What they do not fully explain is verified veridical perception, specifically accurate knowledge of events occurring outside the body during periods when normal brain function would not be expected. That is the gap van Lommel and Parnia are investigating. The Bardo total does not offer a competing neuroscience theory. It is not a medical study. It is a map of the experiential territory. Physics measures from the outside, the Tibetan tradition mapped from the inside. 2 instruments, the same territory. Before the Tibetan map, notice something directly for 20 seconds. The question van Lommel spent 13 years investigating is the question every human being carries. You carry it right now. What continues? Not as a philosophical proposition, as a question you can feel the weight of. Notice what it is like to hold that question without immediately answering it. That is exactly where the Tibetan monks began their investigation. A navigational map. Not a philosophical treatise, not a description of belief, a precise set of instructions for what consciousness encounters at the moment of death and what to do when it arrives. That is what the Bardo total is. Tibetan tradition attributes these teachings to Padmasambhava, the Indian master who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century CE. Concealed as a terma, a hidden treasure text, and rediscovered by the Tibetan master Karma Lingpa in the 14th century. Bardo means intermediate state. Total means liberation through hearing. The text was traditionally read aloud near the dying and after death as guidance for the consciousness believed to be traversing the Bardo. Not as metaphor, as a map. The Bardo Thodol describes 3 Bardos, 3 phases of the intermediate state. The first is Chikai Bardo, the moment of death itself. The text describes an immediate experience of brilliant, clear, limitless light. Not a light seen from the outside, a light that is awareness itself, suddenly recognized without the filter of the body. In clinical NDE reports, across van Lommel's 344 patients, across the AWARE study's documented cases, across Kenneth Ring's 1,980 analysis of 102 accounts, the most consistently reported element is a light. Described as warm, as deeply familiar, as more real than ordinary waking experience. The Bardo Thodol names this the Dharmata, the nature of reality itself, appearing to consciousness unmediated for the first time. The second Bardo is Chonyad Bardo, the Bardo of reality's nature. The text describes an encounter with projections of one's own consciousness, peaceful and wrathful forms arising from the unresolved patterns of one's life. In clinical NDE research, this corresponds to the life review. Not a passive observation, a full re-experiencing of significant events, often with the felt perspective of everyone involved. Van Lommel's patients described this consistently. The life review occurred not as memory, but as re-presence. The Bardo Thodal's instruction at this stage is precise. Do not be frightened by the projections. They arise from your own mind. Recognition ends the cycle. The third Bardo is Sidpa Bardo, the approach to return. The text describes a threshold, a boundary at which consciousness either continues forward or returns to embodiment. In NDE research, this corresponds to the moment of decision or boundary, the point at which patients reported being told it was not yet time, or at which they chose to return for the sake of those they loved. The structural parallels are striking. Van Lommel's documented sequence: out-of-body awareness, movement toward light, encounter with deceased relatives, life review, threshold, or boundary, return. The Bardo Thodal sequence: Chikai clear light, Chonyad projections and review, Sidpa threshold and return. Comparable structure. Different instruments. 12 centuries apart. The Tibetan tradition mapped the stages of the Bardo from the perspective of the practitioner moving through them. It answered the question, what will you encounter? The Upanishadic tradition approached the same territory from an entirely different direction. Not through a map of the stages, not through clinical documentation, through a direct conversation with death itself. And it asked a deeper question. Not what does consciousness encounter, but what is consciousness, fundamentally, that it can encounter anything at all. In the Katha Upanishad, scholars date this text to approximately the 5th to 3rd century BCE, when a young man named Nachiketa arrived at the house of Yama, the Lord of Death, and waited 3 days for him to return. When Yama arrived and found Nachiketa waiting, he offered 3 boons for his patients. Nachiketa used the first boon to ask for peace with his father, the second to ask about the sacred fire of knowledge, the third to ask the question. Van Lommel spent 13 years investigating. He asked, what is it that continues after the body dies? Yama's initial response, as the text records it, was reluctance. He offered Nachiketa kingdoms, wealth, pleasures. He said, this knowledge is subtle. Even the gods have debated it. Choose something else. Nachiketa refused. His response, paraphrased from the translation by Eknath Iswaran: there is nothing you can offer that equals this question. The nature of what continues after death is the only question that matters. Yama then taught. His instruction made a precise distinction between 2 aspects of what a human being is. The first is the body, mind, and personality, all that is born, changes, and eventually dies. The second is Atman, described not as a soul in the Western sense, not as a personal entity that survives, but as the witness consciousness, the aware presence that observes all experience without itself being an experience. From the first chapter of the Katha Upanishad, paraphrased from the translation by Gambhirananda: the Atman is not born, it does not die, it has not come into being, and it will not come into being. It is unborn, eternal, ancient. It is not killed when the body is killed. The distinction Yama draws is structurally precise. He is not saying the personality survives death. He is not describing the continuation of memory or identity. He is describing the witness, the aware presence behind all experience, as that which is not subject to arising and ceasing. This maps to Van Lommel's hypothesis with structural precision. If consciousness is not generated by the brain but transmitted through it, then what persists is not the personal narrative, not the memories, not the preferences. What persists is awareness itself. The Bardo Thodal's instruction at the moment of death uses exactly this framing. Recognize the clear light of your own awareness. Do not be distracted by the projections of the personal mind. What you are, fundamentally, does not move. Yama says, the Atman does not move. Van Lommel says, consciousness is non-local. The Bardo Thodal says, the clear light is your own nature, already present, requiring only recognition. 3 investigations, 3 different methods, yet each points toward the possibility that awareness may be more fundamental than we usually assume. The structural parallel across all 3 investigations. Van Lommel. Some patients reported experiences suggesting awareness may continue during clinical death. Bardo Thodal. In Chikai Bardo, awareness recognizes itself without the body as its container. Katha Upanishad. Atman is not housed in the body. The body is its temporary instrument. Van Lommel. A consistent sequence of experience occurs regardless of culture, religion, or prior belief. Bardo Thodal. The stages of the Bardo are universal, arising from the nature of consciousness itself, not personal history. Katha Upanishad. The Atman is not individual. It is the witness present in all beings. Van Lommel. Some patients reported perceptions that researchers argue are difficult to explain through conventional neurological models alone. Bardo Thodal. The clear light of Chikai Bardo is the most vivid state of awareness a person can experience, occurring precisely when the physical body has stopped. Katha Upanishad. The Atman is described as more awake than waking consciousness, subtler than the subtle. Physics has not resolved the hard problem of consciousness. It has not explained what awareness is, where it arises, or why there is experience at all. Van Lommel and Parnia do not resolve it either. But they highlight phenomena that remain difficult for current materialist explanations to fully account for. And on the other side of that boundary, 2 traditions from 2 continents, separated by centuries, had already left their maps. The Tibetan instruction is precise, and it does not require death to test. The Bardo Thodal was read to the living as preparation, not because death was imminent, because the clear light of awareness is accessible right now, in the background of every experience. Test this directly for 30 seconds, not as a meditation, as a direct observation. Right now, there is awareness present. You are hearing these words. Something is hearing them. That something is not a thought. Thoughts arise within it. It is not an emotion. Emotions arise within it. It does not have a boundary you can locate. That awareness, present right now, is what Yama described to Nachiketa. It is what the Bardo Thodal calls the clear light. It is what Van Lommel's patients described as more real than ordinary waking. They were not discovering something new. They were recognizing something that was present before the cardiac arrest, during it, and after it. The question is not what happens after death. The question is what you are before the question arises. Van Lommel spent 13 years documenting what the dying reported. Padmasambhava spent a lifetime mapping what consciousness encounters when the body stops. Nachiketa asked the only question that mattered. Yama answered. 2 instruments, 1 territory. Ancient wisdom, quantum mystery, direct knowing. If the Bardo's structural sequence, or Yama's distinction between self and Atman resonated, you already know what the investigation requires. The next map is already written. It is from the tradition that produced Schrödinger, approached from the direction of the observer. It is in the description.